Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. In a landmark decision, the US Supreme Court has banned race-based admissions in colleges and universities, a long-standing precedent that has benefited Black and Latino students in higher education. The Chief Justice said students must be evaluated based on their experiences as an individual and not on the basis of race. The court said admission programs by Harvard and University of North Carolina violated the Equal Protection Clause because they failed to offer measurable objectives to justify the use of race. The court further added that the programs involve racial stereotyping and had no specific endpoint. Joining us now to talk more on the significant ruling, we're joined by Ro Khanna, representative of California Congress and member of the Democratic Party. We will also be speaking to Ro Khanna about the Prime Minister's visit to the United States and the future of Indo-US ties in defense, critical technology and trade. Mr. Khanna, the Biden administration has condemned the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. How do you think this will hurt or impact the student community in the United States?
Well, it's a challenge. As a graduate of Yale Law School and the University of Chicago, I benefited from having a very diverse student body, people who were of Asian American background, Indian American background, African American background, Latino background, and of course, white students. And this has prepared me to be a leader representing Silicon Valley in Congress. We would be doing a disservice to our students and educational institutions if we lose that diversity.
How do you think Asian Americans could be impacted by this?
The universities could be impacted, absolutely. I mean, this is going to make it harder for universities, colleges to have the diverse representation. I mean, these institutions are remarkable in getting people from every part of America and having students from different parts of the world. And now it's going to make that a harder challenge for them.
Right. What will be the legal way out of this? How difficult would you think it is to get a legal way out and reverse back to the earlier policy?
Well, Justice Roberts has said that in students' essays, they can refer to their race, they can refer to their background and their hardships and their life experience. So that may be something that the admissions officers can work with. I know university presidents are looking for ways to keep the diversity on their college campuses while complying with the law. And I think in the next 3-4 months, they were going to do a hard work to make sure America doesn't lose this competitive edge of having some of the most diverse colleges and universities in the world.
Right. Congressman Khanna, coming to the Prime Minister's visit last week, he spent a considerable time with American businesses, with President Biden as well. What do you think this visit and the talks between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi do for Indo-US ties going forward?
In strengthening the ties. It was a very successful visit. We had the jet engine deal that was announced to India. India is committed to purchasing a lot of new advanced defense technology from the United States, helping create jobs in the United States, helping bring our countries together. There is technology partnership. I was able to meet with the Prime Minister for about 25 minutes. We had a wide-ranging discussion on the importance of technology, on climate change, on the importance of defense cooperation, on the importance of people-to-people ties. He was well aware of the 5 Indian Americans in Congress, and we discussed pluralism, we discussed human rights. So it was a very constructive few days.
Right. To ask you about the GHAL deal, it has been said that US has not transferred this level of technology to any other ally, and this is an unprecedented deal. Will it go through the US Congress easily because it needs an authorization from the US Congress?
I believe it will, and I have led on this as the US-Indo co-chair in Congress. Mike Waltz and I have been leading, and I expect that it will go through, and we will continue to work for it. I led last year the amendment to make sure India didn't face sanctions, CAATSA sanctions, under the regime that was penalizing anyone that had business relationships with Russia, because I wanted to make sure that the US-India relationship continued to improve. And I think the same coalition that voted for that amendment will vote to approve this.
Right. From you, Congressman Khanna, was there any kind of message also from US politicians, the US government, to the Prime Minister on the Ukraine war? What kind of a role India can play in stopping this war?
That emerged in discussions. I think it was important that the Prime Minister affirmed the principle of sovereignty, that Ukraine's territorial sovereignty matters, that they have to have territorial integrity, and that Russia should not be encroaching on Ukrainian territory. And what the end of the war entails is Russia pulling out of the territories that it invaded illegally. I do think the Prime Minister in India can play a role, hopefully, in bringing us to a just peace.
Right. Also to ask you about the importance of this visit and the relationship with India for President Biden at this juncture and for the United States at a time where it's trying to counter the expansionist, the aggressive economic version of China at one hand. It is trying to counter Russia. How significant is the time, the investments US is making in the relationship with India?
It's one of the most important allies for the United States in the 21st century. It's a incredibly important ally. We have, of course, strong people-to-people ties, cultural ties with India that should not be underestimated, and that was on full display with the Prime Minister's visit. But we also have mutual interests. Neither the United States or India wants to see China emerge as a hegemon in Asia with its territorial expansionist ambitions. And the relationship can make sure that no country emerges as a hegemon in Asia, and that we respect the self-determination of all nations in the world.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the unfinished agenda. Do you feel there are certain areas where India can remove barriers or tweak policies in order to gain more investments from the United States, have a bigger presence of the US business community?
Well, I was talking to Tim Cook, Apple CEO. I know they're investing. They're in my district. They're investing in moving from China to India. Some of their supply chain and other companies are looking at the same thing. There is still a fair amount of bureaucratic challenges in doing that. There's less corruption, which has been a positive. But to the extent that that process of allowing companies to move from China to India, to have India emerge as the manufacturing hub of Asia, can be made easier, the more companies like Apple you will see making that move.
Right. My last question, Congressman Khanna, of course, there was a big debate in India. This was about Barack Obama's statements on minority rights in India. How do you see this backlash that came from Indian politicians, the Indian government?
I think what President Obama said was basically U.S. policy. And President Obama, of course, was a very pro-India president. And all he said was that while we have strong relationships with India, while we strengthen that relationship, both countries need to make sure that we are protecting minority rights and pluralism. That is a challenge within the United States. We've had debates about how we strengthen voting rights in America, how we make sure that we don't have police violence against young men of color who are maybe unarmed. It's a challenge for our own nation, and it's a challenge within India. Any nation that is a multi-ethnic society, multiracial society, faces challenges of being a strong liberal democracy. And I think that's all President Obama was saying.
Right. And one more question. We saw at least 8 or 10 deals being signed, predominantly the technology partnership, especially on critical and emerging technologies being lifted to another level. What more investments and what more regulatory changes do you expect that will take place within the US administration to enable more technology transfer to India in the days to come, both through executive actions and through legislative actions, both in defense and in the field of other critical technologies?
Well, I'm leading the amendment with Senator Warner to have India recognized as a major non-NATO ally. Of course, it doesn't make sense to have India in NATO. NATO is largely European, and I don't think India would want to march lockstep with U.S. policy, being an independent nation that has its own geopolitical interests and foreign policy. But they can be a major non-NATO ally. That would facilitate even more sensitive technology and defense cooperation. But apart from that, one of the areas we need to improve is scientific research. The United States has far more joint papers penned with Chinese scientists at the National Science Foundation than with Indian scientists and Indian researchers. Now, part of that is a lot of the Indian researchers and scientists are now in the United States or in Europe because of the diaspora. But there's still a lot of brilliant people within India, of course, and we need to facilitate more of that cooperation.
All right. Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on the Indo-US relationship going forward and what are some of the unfinished agenda that India needs to work on in order to gain more investments from US companies. Thanks once again for being with us.
Thank you very much.
On that note, we take a short break here on Global Eye, but don't go anywhere. When we return, we'll get you an exclusive interview with the World Bank Country Director on the investment, the funding that has been announced by the World Bank for India's renewable energy transition. In a major boost to India's zero-carbon mission, the World Bank has sanctioned a $1.5 billion loan to finance the country's development of low-carbon energy. In a press statement, the organization said that the financing is aimed at helping India in scaling up renewable energy, developing green hydrogen, and stimulating climate finance for low-carbon energy investments. India intends to achieve the net zero goal by 2070. World Bank's program is expected to aid the implementation of the National Green Hydrogen Mission. To discuss the contours of the program, we're now joined by Auguste Tano Kwame, World Bank Country Director for India. Mr. Kwame, thank you very much for joining us. Give us a sense of the contours, the pillars of this $1.5 billion funding program for India's renewable energy transition.
Thank you very much. As you said, India is very committed to achieving net zero by 2070. And this program that we just approved yesterday for $1.5 billion called Low Carbon Development Policy Operation is to support India's transition to its own net zero goal. And to do that, the operations has three pillars. The first pillar is to support green hydrogen development, which was well established in the National Green Hydrogen Mission launched earlier this year. To do that, under the first pillar, the operation will be supporting how government is encouraging demand for green hydrogen, as well as supporting production of green hydrogen by reducing costs and closing viability gaps funding. The second pillar of the operation is to support renewable energy. We all know that green hydrogen requires renewable energy, and therefore the second pillar will also boost demand and supply for renewable energy, such as solar, for example, where India has invested a lot and has made a lot of progress, but additional production for renewable energy is needed to support the green hydrogen mission. The third pillar is, we all know that it's important to bring in private sector and green finance to support production of renewable energy and green hydrogen. So the third pillar of the operation will do exactly that. It will help launch the carbon market, as well as boosting private sector investment into renewable energy.
Right. India had announced a $2.3 billion program for green hydrogen and electrolyzer manufacturing in the month of January. How much of this $1.5 billion funding program that you have now announced will go towards India's green hydrogen mission directly in the form of incentives? Or is the latest announcement that you're talking about over and above what the Indian government has already announced?
The operation is a development policy loans, which means that it supports policies and regulations. It does not provide direct financing for specific expenditure items. We providing $1.5 billion to support the government's broader green hydrogen mission, but not just that. As you heard me mention earlier, the operation will also support the scaling up of renewable energy other than green hydrogen, as well as boosting green finance and private sector investment into renewable energy, as well as green hydrogen. So whilst we don't make a direct link between the financing of the operation and the cost of the National Green Hydrogen Mission, we're very happy that the 1.5 billion operation will support the broader development of green hydrogen, renewable energy, and green finance in India.
Right. Today, the government has formally rolled out schemes for incentivizing manufacturing of green hydrogen and electrolyzers. How do you think these incentives that the government has come out with compare to incentives from other countries?
Yeah, we have looked at how countries are developing green hydrogen. You know, green hydrogen is a very new technology, but a number of countries are looking into it in developed countries as well as in developing countries. And we're very proud at the World Bank for having launched what we call Hydrogen for Development Initiative at COP27. And this gives us a framework of how we see green hydrogen technology being developed, especially in developing country context. And in fact, the day before the board approved the 1.5 billion low carbon energy program for India, our board also approved a similar operation for Chile. And the idea behind these operations is that there will be sufficient boost or support for renewable energy so that green hydrogen can tap into the renewable energy supply without affecting countries' ability to meet the NDCs, whereby they also want to improve renewable energy production for direct electricity consumption. The second thing, where we think the government mission is consistent with where we see the technology going, is the importance of supporting demand. Because if demand is not strong enough, investors will have doubt as to whether their production will be taken up, whether there will be some off-take risks. And the third thing is to provide viability gap funding, because it's a new technology and there are some hesitations or uncertainty on the part of investors. So the government incentive scheme that we've seen is very consistent with what we see as the way to go to boost this new technology, especially in developing countries.
Right. Your statement also speaks about this $1.5 billion funding being the first step of 2 envisaged operations. What will be the next announcement, and when will the next step towards India's energy transition be made by the World Bank?
We hope to have a long-term engagement with the government of India on renewable energy and green hydrogen in particular. Green hydrogen is a new technology. It's just being launched in many countries, including India. For us, we see this operation as the first in a series of programs and projects to support the government of India's agenda. In the specific case of the operation that we approved yesterday, there will be a second phase. We don't know when the exact timing of the second phase will be. It will be determined by the preferences of the government of India and the World Bank jointly. But we do hope that this operation is not a one-off engagement. We hope it will be a long-term engagement between the World Bank and India.
Right. The World Bank has also been working on a global alliance on green hydrogen, and they have been very closely coordinating and speaking to the Indian government about this. Could you give us a sense of what will be India's role in this alliance and what will be this alliance aimed towards?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me say that India is part of this alliance, and in fact, after launching the initiative at COP27, we have had our first and only meeting so far of the Hydrogen for Development Initiative, and that meeting took place in India. So it shows that India is in the lead in making this Hydrogen for Development a very useful initiative for members. And the objective of the Hydrogen for Development Initiative is first to facilitate knowledge exchange between countries on the technology and the innovation, and we hope that India will play a role in sharing its own experience with other countries that will come later on into the green hydrogen industry or movement. The second thing that the Hydrogen for Development Initiative aims to do is to help mobilize financing for green hydrogen in members of the initiative. And we've done just that with the World Bank-owned financing and supported by also other sources of funding. We hope that the alliance will be delivering for India as well as for other member countries. So India has been a very active member of the Hydrogen for Development, and we appreciate India's contribution so far.
Right. What are some of the steps that India needs to take in order to encourage companies to switch to using green hydrogen manufacturing? Do we need certain mandates? How do you think India will benefit with greater use of green hydrogen in manufacturing, and which are the sectors where you see an implementation of this scheme in the near future?
Well, first of all, it's very important to recognize that the development of green hydrogen will be driven by costs. And, as we had seen in India for the solar energy, when costs come down, the private sector gets into adopting the technology. When uncertainties are removed, the private sector gets interested in adopting the technology. So what the program is aiming to do here is to provide initial support for reducing the viability gaps funding, therefore some element of subsidy to help reduce cost. Secondly, encouraging demand so that with demand there will be greater supply, and with that the cost will also come down. And there will be also some discovery of technology, so there will be continuous learning through research and development, which the National Green Hydrogen Mission will also support. And with this combination, the private sector will increasingly adopt the industry. Now, I should also mention that financing is also a very important part. So the third pillar of the operation, which will help mobilize private financing, will also help the private sector adopt the technology on the production side. On the usage side, the private sector will also, industries and manufacturing will be driven by prices. If the price of green hydrogen is competitive, they will adopt it, and we think that they might even adopt it without additional mandate. So, we need to watch how the technology goes and how the prices and costs evolve, and then see whether there are additional needs for actions to stimulate demand or supply.
Right. Mr. Auguste Tanukwame, thank you so much for joining us, telling us about the $1.5 billion funding program that the World Bank has launched for India's renewable energy transition and the importance of the green hydrogen mission as well. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.